So, let's break this down. President Trump's trade wars, and let's be clear, weren't just random moves, but were part of a deliberate strategy. At the core was China, a nation he often accused of unfair trade practices, things like intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and trade imbalances. His tariffs aimed to, well, level the playing field, as he put it. But were they effective? That's up for debate.
Nah, Vikram. Hold on. Effective or not, they were necessary. China's been eating our lunch for decades. It's about time someone had the guts to say, hey, we ain't playing nice anymore. What's the big deal with a little disruption if it means bringing jobs back home?
I get that perspective, but the disruption wasn't exactly little, Duke. The ripple effects were massive. When tariffs hit Chinese goods, Beijing retaliated with tariffs of their own, targeting American products, especially agriculture. Farmers bore the brunt, with products like soybeans and pork getting priced out of lucrative markets. Supply chains were thrown into chaos, and let's not forget the resulting inflationary pressures on consumer goods here in the US.
Sure, but Vikram, wars always have casualties, man. That's standard operating procedure. You think World War II vets were worried about rationing sugar and steel? No, they focused on the mission. Same here. Farmers, manufacturers, they're patriots, tough as nails. They get the stakes.
An interesting analogy. A trade war likened to a military one. In fact, economists have noted how these tariffs follow a tactical logic. They apply pressure not just economically, but also geopolitically. Look at the allies Trump rallied to target China, even imposing joint sanctions with Japan and pushing NATO members to toe similar lines. It's, I guess, an economic battlefield with global consequences.
Global consequences. We got to talk about how everyone started scrambling. China was forced to pivot, you know. They stepped up their game in Africa, Latin America, even Europe. New markets, new partners. If you ask me, we just tipped our own hand and showed them how to play smarter.
A fair point. China did adapt quickly, solidifying trade networks through initiatives like the Belt and Road. And here's the kicker. Some argue Trump's policies strengthened China's resolve instead of weakening it. It goes back to whether the tariffs were a blunt tool instead of a surgical instrument for real reform.
Blunt tool or not, it got results. Look at how the whole world started talking about de-dollarization again. China ramping up their gold buys, trying to prop up alternatives to the US dollar, even roping in BRICS nations. Don't tell me that ain't proof this ain't just a game of economic chess.
Which brings us to the multidimensional nature of trade wars. It wasn't just tariffs, it was about currency battles, supply chain independence, and reshaping alliances. But Duke, does that mean we're ready for the next chapter of this competition with China? And what's the net gain for the US in all this? It's still unclear. So speaking of this multidimensional battlefield, one of the ripple effects we've seen is China's strategic pivot toward gold. Duke, did you notice how China's been quietly ramping up their gold purchases? Even Goldman Sachs revised their projections, now expecting gold prices to hit unprecedented highs. It's not just about trade anymore. This is part of their clear plan to reduce reliance on the US dollar, using gold reserves as a weapon in this ongoing economic chess match.
Yeah, I've heard. They ain't just stocking gold for rainy days. This is a move, strategic planning, same way we prep logistics before a mission. It's like they're building up ammo for economic warfare. BRICS nations jumping in too? That's got to raise some red flags.
Exactly. The BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they've been pushing for monetary independence from the US, and Trump's tariffs, well, they've accelerated this de-dollarization goal. The idea is to introduce alternatives to the dollar as the global reserve currency, which could fundamentally reshape international markets.
Okay, but here's the kicker. If BRICS wants out from the dollar's shadow, why stop there? They're already looking at commodity-based currencies. Gold's just the beginning, Vikram, and you can bet they'll weaponize it like crazy.
True, and these strategies are interconnected. Think about Trump's tariffs. They weren't just punitive. They served as leverage to promote domestic manufacturing. It's a tried and true method, using economic pressure to stimulate growth at home while controlling external dependencies. But does that level of control ultimately justify the complications?
Complications? Kinda like battlefield plans, Vikram. Nothing ever goes perfect. Yeah, tariffs shook up supply chains and ticked off some allies, But they also reopened factories, brought some jobs back stateside. That's mission success in my book.
Perhaps. Still, experts warn about using tariffs as a one-size-fits-all approach. The ripple effects on pricing, market stability, even diplomatic relations, those can have long-term costs. For example, while we were ramping up the pressure, China started forging deeper economic ties with Europe and Africa. Some say it left the US playing catch-up.
But that ain't new, Vikram. You back someone into a corner, they're gonna get creative. I mean, look at wartime logistics. You lose an airstrip, you build one from scratch somewhere else. Tariffs? Same logic. They force the enemy to adapt while you double down on your own manufacturing base.
A valid analogy, but let's not ignore the risks. If these moves push us into a fragmented global order, deglobalization could harm growth across the board. The question remains, are the US and its allies prepared to navigate this new economic balance effectively? Duke, as we were discussing about economic ripple effects, Europe's situation presents a fascinating parallel. They're reducing reliance on Russian energy while simultaneously deepening trade ties with China. Did you know that between 2017 and 2023, Europe's imports from China actually increased? It's interesting how this contrasts sharply with trends in the US or Japan, where imports from China have decreased. A true reflection of the global balancing act we were talking about.
So they're swapping one dependency for another? Come on, Vikram. That's not strategy. That's short-sighted. Europe's acting like they're just patching up a leaky boat without plugging the hole. China's got them by the collar now.
True, it's a delicate balancing act. But let's not overlook the progress. Russian gas, for example, it used to account for something like 40% of European imports. Now, it's down to 8%. That shift, that's a seismic change. Still, you're right, Duke. Relying heavily on Beijing could create a whole new set of vulnerabilities.
No kidding. Look, Vikram, the thing about Europe is they keep outsourcing their problems. Security to the US, energy to Russia, production to China. And now what? They're scrambling, realizing they're, what's the word? Exposed. You can't win a fight standing on someone else's feet.
It's a fair criticism. But this scramble might actually spur some meaningful changes. Leaders like Emmanuel Macron, they've been calling for a united European defense policy for years. It was an idea that seemed, well, almost aspirational back then, but now it's gaining traction.
Aspirational, huh? More like desperate. Macron's got it right. They need to stop relying on Uncle Sam and start arming up. Poland's saying the same thing, right? If Europe's going to survive, it better be armed. And you know what? They're right. You've got to be strong if you want to make it these days.
Perhaps. But arming up isn't just about military capability. It's about economic strength too. Europe needs to rekindle its industrial base, build more, innovate more, and honestly, trade smarter. Otherwise, they're still just reacting to crises instead of preparing for them.
That's the thing, though. Trump's tariffs, or his whole approach, really, it gave him a shove, got Europe thinking about self-reliance. They've started to wake up. But we've seen this before. Waking up isn't the same as actually getting up and doing something.
Right? And while Europe's reevaluating its position, the bigger picture looms. We're seeing a fragmentation of the global economic order, alliances shifting, self-sufficiency taking precedence. The question is, are these nations prepared for the ripple effects, the economic realignments that come with such changes? I mean, Duke, are we?
Good question. Look, I'm all for fighting for your own, manufacturing, defense, whatever. But what happens when Europe does wake up? Are we ready for a world where everyone's watching their own six and not leaning on us anymore? That's the next fight, Vikram.
A fight for balance, perhaps, between collaboration and independence, dependency and self-reliance. In many ways, Trump's trade wars and the wider economic shifts they've sparked, it's not just about tariffs or exports, it's about reshaping how nations view the very concept of globalization. And that's a long game.
Long game, short game. Doesn't matter, Vikram. You go in, fight your corner, and keep moving forward. That's how you win, plain and simple.
Perhaps there's wisdom in that simplicity, Duke. And on that note, I think we've covered plenty today, from tariffs to trade shifts to Europe's awakening. The global economic landscape is shifting in ways we're all still trying to comprehend. But one thing's clear, the fallout from these moves will shape the future for decades. And with that, Duke, let's wrap it up.
Roger that, Vikram. Folks, you've been listening to Trade Wars and Global Economic Shifts. Take care out there, and we'll catch you next time.